traditionally, Indonesia just does a lot more protectionist policies. It's been known to create restrictions, import tariffs, all of these things in order to protect its own industries. That's a shorter term thinking. If you look at the crux of the problem in places like Indonesia, which is very similar to other emerging markets, the question becomes more, what is the country's ease of doing business? How easy is it to do business in Indonesia with or without China, with or without other international influences when you're talking about an industry in Indonesia, whether you're talking about what we call MSMEs or you talk about larger industries? How easy is it to do business there?
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Evo Commerce sells premium affordable supplements and personal care electronics, operating in Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. Strive brand sells salon-grade quality products for home use and using direct-to-consumer channels through its online retail channels and physical shops. BBAC is the leader in hangover remedies in over 2,000 retail outlets across the region. Learn more at bbac.co and stryv.co. Morning, Gita.
Morning.
Yeah, well, another bright and sunny day.
As always, living in Asia.
The opposite would be like monsoon rain, I guess.
That's true. That's true.
So I think the big news that both you and I were reacting to was the recent announcement by Indonesia for import tariffs of up to 200% on Chinese goods across footwear, clothing, textiles, cosmetics, and ceramics. And obviously, there's still some parts of the policy that hasn't been shaked out, but I think that's pretty much a direction. How do you feel?
Well, a direct quote from the article that talks about this import tariff situation. The trade minister of Indonesia actually said, well, if the US can do tariffs, so can we. Not really sure, of course, if that really is the way forward, that we constantly copy what the US is doing, but definitely it shows that the entire US-China situation does affect how other countries will behave in the future. And I think right now, what's happening with the import tariffs is most likely a combination of not only is it seen as a way for China to dump a lot of its products into Indonesia, and it makes it very hard for businesses in Indonesia to be competitive in terms of pricing. I mean, very similar story that you hear in other countries across the pond, but also it shows that as policymakers, you also need to think about how do macroeconomic conditions in your neighboring countries or your ally countries or any other countries around you will affect you in the future. I think my big worry with Indonesia is our tendency to also see an issue and put a band-aid on it rather than also think holistically, actually, what is the real crux of the problem? Is it truly China, or is it stuff and the system structures within Indonesia itself that might make it problematic with or without any China influence?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a popular topic today, right? Tariffs and the concept of what do we do with Chinese goods. And I think it was interesting for me to read that this is not the first time that Jakarta has tried to do this. So last year, it had issued regulations to try using import quotas instead of a tariff. So similar product categories of food ingredients, footwear, electronics, and chemicals. But it was eventually changed a lot because the problem with a quota is that it makes it difficult for the supply chain to work, right? Because so you can only import a certain number and then you have to find somebody else. Whereas a tariff feels a bit more straightforward. It's just a taxation of the price, but you can import as much as you want. But I think both of these are different ways to solve the concept of Chinese competition, right? Their supply chain, and we talked about it in previous episodes between you and I think it shows up in EVs and solar cells. Like they have the in policy, they're highly competitive. I think the US is calling it overcapacity today. I guess it was just, I think a nice way of saying very competitive. I think they said that about the Japanese car industry about 30, 40 years ago. And so I think there's an interesting dynamic where you're like saying is the Chinese industrial policy is very effective so that companies are very competitive. And now what do each country's domestic industry deal? Do we get better competing with them, or do we like tax those imports and create a bit of a shelter from that effect?
I think traditionally Indonesia just does a lot more protectionist policies. Historically, it's been known to do that. It's been known to create restrictions, import tariffs, all of these things in order to protect its own industries. But again, that's a shorter term thinking. If you look at the premise of the problem in places like Indonesia, which is very similar to other emerging markets, I think the question becomes more, what is the country's ease of doing business? That really is the question, right? Like, how easy is it to do business in Indonesia with or without China? This is what I'm saying. Like, with or without other international influences, really, when you're talking about an industry in Indonesia, whether you're talking about what we call MSMEs or UMKM, or you talk about larger industries, how easy is it to do business there? And for anyone living in Indonesia or attempting to do business in Indonesia, they know it's very challenging. They know that opening a legal entity takes a long time. They know that even opening a bank account can be challenging. They know all of these things to be an issue. So I think, again, all these import tariffs, in the end, they will address the issue up to a certain point. But if you're trying to go past that point and think long term, then you really have to get back to fixing the system, right? You have to get back to making Indonesia more pro business, pro private sector, like a pro free market type of policies. And the thing is, there are also ways you can do it without sacrificing certain parts of the constitution that Indonesians really believe in. So there's no one saying that if you are pro business, therefore you are anti labor. And that's a conversation that happens in politics here. So if you're pro private sector, you are anti labor. If you're pro business, you are anti equity. And it doesn't always have to be that way. So I think, again, trying to think outside of the binary view that one has to be one thing or another, and you cannot make your own blend for the system for your own country is just one of those narrow thinking that the country should learn to move away from. Basically, how do you create policies that both benefit your industries also benefit your people?
Yeah, and I think it's really about growing the pie rather than dividing the
Yep.
pie. And I think
Yep.
tariffs, from a pure economics perspective, I think it's a short term, like you said, it's popular politically because whoever is protected as a manufacturer by the tariff is obviously a strong lobby group no matter what. So domestic producers must be like thumbs up. But of course, the cost of it is more diffused across the consumers of those products. And so I think, for example, Trump is proposing a 10% tariff on all global imports. And that would be a
Okay.
taxation of effectively prices would rise for the average family in
Yes.
America about $2,000, which is no joke because there's a lot of money and basically it creates an inflation because now you can't buy cheap Chinese footwear. Now you have to buy domestic,
Right.
which is more expensive. And that's the US example. But I think for
Yep.
me, I think the concern is if tariffs happen in Indonesia and more countries, I think the local consumer is the
Yep.
one that kind of has to pay. Yeah.
But also the local businesses. So when you think of MSMEs, where are they getting their inputs from? So let's say they're putting 100 to 200% tariffs on Chinese clothes, and then you are one of the very many hundreds and thousands of MSMEs that sell clothing. Yeah, that's going to impact your business a lot because then it'll be much harder for you as a wholesaler, or it'll be much harder for you as an online retailer in your own little shop. And I think these are the questions that, again, need to be considered, not just catering to local producers that are of a very large size, but also thinking, how is this going to affect the smaller ones? Because let's say then they do not take on Chinese imported goods and then they have to buy domestic. No matter what, you just increase their OPEX. And those are the things that I don't know if this can last for a very long time.
Yeah. And I think exactly like you said is when we think about policy, we always use the word MSMEs, right? So like micro, small, medium enterprises. Indonesia, 64 million of them. But there's actually quite a large range within that range. And then we also have the domestic conglomerates that do a lot of manufacturing as well. And so I think one thing that I do think about, and I've seen this happen in other countries that have tariff structures, is that it benefits I say medium and the large enterprises, domestic conglomerates for import tariffs in general because they can take on that burden. But I think for micro and small, which also have a larger percentage of their own household income coming from imports as well, cheap imports, I think they tend to be disproportionately impacted. So it's not an easy trade-off policy-wise. And like you said, I think in the perfect world it's okay to have some tariffs perhaps just to give your industry some breathing room. But during that time frame, you kind of like have a set amount and then
Right.
like stagger the withdrawal over the next every 2 years, you drop it, for example, and then you tell your industry, look, you got 10 years to shape up. And I think that's kind of like one middle of the road approach that economists have discussed, but that requires a lot. I think it's a pretty hard political messaging
It
as
is,
well.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard political messaging because it requires people to communicate a long-term strategy to populace that they will need short-term decision making, aka voting for in
Right.
the future. This will be good for you in 10 years, but I need you to vote for me next year. Okay.
Give me the candidate that
Bring
gives me a 1 year bump now.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's, and you can say that as a critique of a democratic system, but no, I think in the end, it's really a critique of systems in general. And also, how do people view the government? And also, how does the government view communicating with their populace? And what I see a lot in Indonesia is this look of the populace as being the quote unquote uninformed mass. So a lot of politicians make decisions and then assume that they're doing it on behalf of the benefit of the people, but the people won't understand. So no need to explain to them a lot of things. And it's totally mistaken, by the way. People do understand.
Yeah.
So if you need to take a long-term view of how you communicate, and that is why communication is so important in public policy. But again, in a lot of emerging markets, when your systems are just still so new, I can understand why a lot of public sector leaders don't see communication as a priority. So they will take a decision that they believe will be good for the masses. And I'm sure they know more than the masses, et cetera, et cetera. And then they expect the mass to just follow up unless the mass rebels against them and makes it violent. And so I think this import tariff thing is another one of those reactive policies that sound good for a short amount of time and seems protectionist for a short amount of time. But again, the problem will come back in a different way through a different example, or maybe with a different country in the future.
Talking about that, it really goes back to the quote you mentioned, which is about, hey, the US can impose a 200% tariff, so we can do it as well. And I think it's interesting because I think historically in Southeast Asia, America has always been that champion of lower tariffs, more free trade. And in fact, a lot of the trade policies that we have were built by American economists, both in
That's true.
Singapore, Indonesia.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the Berkeley gang of economists as well. I think it's just an interesting dynamic where it's kind of like now that America is going into more of a protectionist mode. And of course, as of today, Trump has a 70% chance of a win based on the betting markets and based on the polling forecast. So yeah, and he's definitely pro-tariff. He wants to do more tariffs, a global 10% import tariff and a 60% tariff on all Chinese goods as well. So yeah, I think for me, my perspective is we're going to see more tariffs rather than less over time, actually.
Yeah. I mean, the irony of having a more globalized world is that every country will also start becoming more protectionist. I mean, look at what's happening literally across EU, right? And a lot of it is when, again, when public policy doesn't grow or doesn't develop as fast as reality. You see this in fintech, for example, right? The rise of fintech, crypto, all of these movements, and having so many countries just being unable to keep up with the policy making in terms of these alternative asset classes and all of these modes of payment because they simply just can't develop and can't grow as fast as these things. That's the same with globalization in a way, right? The trade environment in our entire global ecosystem will change the more people become more mobile, more digitized, people can access information more freely. And again, you have a lot of these policymakers, and nothing necessarily against their age, but the majority of them are a lot older than the people they lead, than the populace. And it makes for this information gap. So
Yeah.
what happens when you have, for example, look at the US election, what happens when you have nearly 80 and 80-year-olds fighting and competing to lead a country where it's a lot of them are under 80 and you have this information gap and also a gap of interest, like there are differences in interest. So if you're 40 and under, you might have a different interest than if you're 70 and up, right? 70 and up, you're thinking of certain concerns. 40 and under, you're thinking of other concerns. And I think this is what you're starting to see in also a lot of countries. There is this exact argument that was being made during the Indonesian election just several months back. That was why there was this push of let's have more young people in the government, not just our VP, but literally everyone else. Like, why can't we have more young people as a minister or more young people in the legislative? Why can't we have more of these? And again, this is the question of what happens when you have very large democracies, not just Indonesia, but India and other countries, when the leaders and the populace have both an information and also an interest gap. So again, these are the issues that I think a lot of public policy makers need to really think about. Like, how close are you to the friction that is really happening in real life? It's like, how can Indonesian ministers make decisions about public transportation if they don't use public transportation? Like, how do you know how bad it gets? And you can say that about a lot of things too in the US elections. When you have these leaders criticizing certain things, how do you know? When was the last time you had to rely on pension or on Social Security or on Medicare or all of these things?
I 100% agree with you about that. And I think it's never an easy balancing the domestic reality versus the economic rules of gravity. It's because we all know that tariffs impose these costs. We all know that tariffs transfers wealth and welfare from one person to another class of people. So I think it's all known at this point. So it's going to be quite interesting how to see how it shakes out. I guess for me, the interesting part is just I feel like the world is just going to move towards becoming more of a protectionist approach. And I think as a result, I think inflation will stay up higher for longer because if your cost of living is going to stay high because you're not allowing these cheaper imports. And so if you have high inflation, then on average, interest rates will be a bit higher on average as well to control that. And now, of course, with interest rates a bit higher, then to some extent, the tech sector would do a little bit worse because of the cost of capital for waiting for profits to come out is much shorter as a result. So actually, it's quite interesting to see that weightage, first order, second order, third order effects really rippling through the system.
Including in Indonesia. And another thing is, oftentimes you really realize that so many of these countries are making decisions and they don't realize how it spills over to other regions and other countries. And that's why, in the end, yes, you should always look out for yourself. You should always make the best decision for your region. At the same time, also just being very aware that these effects can ricochet. It can affect tariffs in other countries, which inadvertently end up affecting your tariffs, your country. And I think these are the type of considerations that, again, happens when people make short-term decisions without thinking of what are the long-term impacts on the populace.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's going to happen, I think I've seen more of it happen as well, is more Chinese companies like relocating operations into Indonesia. And I also see that in Thailand as well. So some level of either JV or they are running the factory where it's technically under a domestic company, but then the assembly line, the managers are all Chinese. So definitely seeing that approach and reaction by Chinese companies.
And again, I'm one of those people who don't necessarily believe if something happens, it's good or bad, because in the end, the world will just consistently evolve with or without my preference, right? And the more globalized people become, the more they face exclusionary policies wherever they are, they will try to find other places, right? That's just the movement of people. That's just how people evolve. And for me, it's more about, well, when these things happen, how do you prepare yourself that rather than compete, how do you both leverage it so you both benefit? Because, for example, in Indonesia, yes, there is more movement of that coming into the country. But then again, if that means that they can upscale local workforce, you can have transfer of knowledge, you can have different new systems in place that end up benefiting the populace more. I mean, why not? And then the challenge there will be, how do you have public policy makers who can actually adjust and even let these new systems thrive rather than be protectionist due to fear or due to some preconceived notion, and just see like, where can this new system take us?
Yeah, I agree. What's interesting for me is that in general, it just makes physical things more expensive from my perspective. But the digital world continues to be 100% perfect competition, low cost.
Yeah.
It's like becoming a little bit like a cyberpunk in my head. Cyberpunk in the sense that like everything in person, real is expensive and everything digital is cheap. And I think it's just interesting to see that in my head happening more and more.
No, if you really look at it, again, one of the things that I like about working in Indonesia is how resilient the private sector is. If you
Right.
think about what they go through, what we do in a typical day, knowing that we face so many policies that work against private sector, it's amazing that private sector even can go that far. They do all sorts of things just to survive, just to end up growing. But oftentimes I do wonder what happens if you have better systems in place that allow them to thrive faster, or at least not go through so much headache just to do one thing. So for example, even getting a phone license in Indonesia is really hard and it's really long. And again, there's a lot of fear on things that people don't understand. There's a big misunderstanding on what LLCs are or what funds are or what family offices are. And those are the things that end up holding us back. So again, I think this is where it's very important also for government to start thinking of the importance of communication with people so that people feel that they are part of the mix of the decision making in the country. And also they know that there's a bigger, greater mission at hand rather than going, oh, there's a wound that's bleeding, put another band-aid on it. There's another wound that's bleeding, put another band-aid on it. And before you know it, you might end up with really bad policies that just affect normal people.
Yeah. Is there a push to simplify or cut through the red tape components? I mean, I was just wondering. I know, for example, there was a recent push to consolidate all the different apps into one app.
Yeah. Okay. So I always tell a lot of founders this because founders usually come to me with a solution for a market problem that they see where they go, hey, these inefficiencies happen and I can solve them. And before they say anything, I always go, hey, in emerging market, and honestly, maybe in other markets too, if there's an inefficiency that has happened for a very long time, always ask yourself, who's benefiting from this inefficiency? Because something must be happening right for some people that they're just keeping it this way.
Yeah.
And you see that in a lot of sectors. Like you see that in different market issues. And that's why until today, there's very little you can do to solve that problem. And again, when you talk about streamlining anything at all, in Indonesia, the question is who's benefiting from things being inefficient and why I'm quite anti-tariffs or why I'm quite not fully anti-tariff, but like anti-tariffs that are very high or anti-sweeping restrictions or all those things, because for a lot of emerging markets, the administrator will basically use that law for their own benefit. So they can come up with many ways to leverage a certain gray area, or they leverage a certain hole in the law, or they find a way to just maneuver in the system. And so those are the things that end up making these inefficiencies stay alive. And so I think in the end, the question is more, can the next leader have enough political will to make efficiencies start happening in the system? I think it's a political will issue.
Yeah, so it looks like it's already starting to happen, right? I think Jokowi just basically said, hey, he's told all the ministers to stop launching new apps starting this year. So some of the numbers are the Indonesian government has 27,000 government apps. One ministry can have even over 500 apps. And so currently, over the past year, about 386 million US dollars was spent in creating new apps. And so basically, there's a big push now to consolidate and make them less redundant and make them more efficient.
I agree. President Jokowi has wanted a lot of these ministries to stop building, which is a good thing. But with our latest cyberware attack, in which a hacker literally held hostage hundreds of millions of citizens' data and then gave back the key, gave back the key to the ministry because they felt bad that our government was just not well prepared for a cyber attack, was just both tragic and so sad that we all laughed about it in a very sad way. When you laugh, cry, that's
Yeah.
basically all Indonesian citizens that day. We just laugh, cry, right? Because, wow, yeah, this is how good as it gets for you. So Indonesia has had a lot of cyber attacks, so many. But the most public one just happened very recently, like a couple of weeks ago, in which a group of hackers attacked our database and literally held hostage hundreds of millions of data. And then in a sad twist, after they realized that no one took responsibility and accountability, it's true, no one took responsibility. We just had ministers and head of securities that just went, we didn't know. And it was very embarrassing for the entire country that the hackers gave back the key and opened donation for themselves to say, hey, if you appreciate that we've shown you that your government is not ready, please donate to this link. And I feel those things really just does happen to Indonesia because it really just reflected too, right? Again, this question of, does the government have political will? Does the
Yeah.
government have political will to actually put people in power that have the background or the technical know-how for whatever it is that they're supposed to lead? Is the person in charge of, I don't know, technology, have any technology background? Or are they known to make interviews literally talking about technological term that every Gen Z and millennial know, and they literally don't know about it at all?
Oh, boy.
Yeah. So again, this is a question, and you can't simplify it as saying, oh, that's politics. Because again, if it's politics just for politics' sake, then that's just craziness. Because politics is supposed to have a certain end goal or mission, not just politics for politics' sake, which literally puts hundreds of millions of citizens' well-being and safety in the hand of people who don't understand the gravity of the things that they hold. Yeah. So when I say it really boils down to political will, I need it. Will the next government have enough political will to actually put people in place that can truly lead in whatever sector or whatever the vision they're supposed to lead? Will they put experts in it? Will they have people who are truly knowledgeable that can advise them? These are real questions because we can't have another rerun of hundreds of millions of citizens' data being held hostage. Oh, by the way, it caused a lot of chaos in immigration. So the Autogate, for example, just imagine Autogate for Jakarta Airport, one of the largest airports in the region, completely being dysfunctional for days.
Hopefully things get better. I do have to admit that the idea of a hacker saying like, it's too much work for me to figure out who to blackmail. Because like there's no clear point of contact for me to blackmail properly. For me to crowdsource donations. It's just hilarious at a deep, tragic way, right?
Yeah, it's tragic though. It's laugh cry, right? You're
Yeah.
laughing and you're both just bawling because you're here.
Oh boy. Well, I think it makes sense though, because if you have 27,000 apps, it creates a lot of surface area. Not everybody can have the right cybersecurity. So putting them together from a technocratic perspective is actually a good way to increase security. And I think I find it amusing that the agency is going to be called GovTech Indonesia, which sounds a lot like GovTech Singapore.
I know.
Yeah, so it's literally.
Well, to be fair, Singapore's done a pretty good job with some things, so it's not the worst place to learn.
Yeah. Well, touch wood, because you never
Touch
know.
wood.
You never know. So I wouldn't do a victory lap for Singapore, because
That's
it's
true.
like, for sure, it's like next week, you'll be like, 5 million Singaporeans got their identification leaked as well. Anyway, that has not happened, and hopefully it doesn't happen. But, hackers are getting pretty good these days.
That's true. Yeah.
I guess one interesting thing that you talked about as well is how beyond that, red tape can be simplified. Because what do you think are some opportunities for red tape to be simplified from your perspective?
Again, when you're trying to address any inefficiencies, always ask who's benefiting from the inefficiency. So rather than the way I look at it, rather than try to go against the system, this is why I'm not big into revolutionizing anything, because it's very hard actually to get people who are swimming one way to swim another way. Just think about, how do you replace those people's usual sources of revenue, which is, let's say, from an inefficiency in one system, they're able to get leverage and then make revenue from that. How do you replace it with revenue from another system? A revenue that makes sense, that is, right? How do you create incentives so that people don't feel that their livelihoods are being threatened if they switch? And I think that's really the big question, because again, when you're trying to cut out middle people, I always find that to be a very tough war to go for, because when you cut them out, they're going to rebel somehow. So more about, how do you work with them? So how do you formalize them even? How do you formalize them into a system so they don't feel that by supporting the system, they're taken out? And I think it's really that question. So rather than cutting people out, find ways to incorporate them, but in a way that makes sense for whatever problem that you're trying to solve. And it's that. But so far, to be honest, a lot of systems haven't done the best in solving that problem. They usually find it much easier to just cut people out, cut channels out. And the only question you'll have with that is, these people and these channels will pop up somewhere else. It's more about, then how do you find a way to incorporate people? How do you get buy-in? And I think getting buy-in for whatever problem that you're trying to solve is key.
Yeah. Well, seems like the only winner for sure is app developers for the government. So
that's true.
Yeah. On that note, let's call it a day.
Awesome. Thank you so much for another fun times talking about public policy, economics, and what people are doing on the ground.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.